Dr. Karungu, a significant moment for Africa. What do we do with this moment?
I think overall we need to put everything into perspective. The continent is about to make a dramatic move in economic terms for two reasons. It has probably the youngest workforce worldwide. The median age for the workforce in Africa is about 18.6 years. Number two, our current GDP in the whole of continent is in excess of almost $2 trillion. By any statistics, and these are the facts, we use a 70 number rule. That is, if the growth rate is 10%, the output will double by 70 divided by 10. If they say the growth rate will be 6%, then the African GDP will double by 70 divided by 6. We are talking of very, very short period. It is estimated today the continent could be sitting on $1.4 trillion of consumable income. That in itself says that the continent is about to do an upsurge that was not expected 10, 15 years ago. Question is, does that mean the continent would be developed? The answer is not necessarily, because there is a huge difference between economic growth and economic development. Economic development entails a growth in all clusters of humanity in economic terms. The poor, the middle, the rich, all of them will have to be taken up, all have to have a positive benefit in economics. That is across the board. It's not skewed to favor the privileged, it's skewed for everybody else. That's economic development. So in my view, we need to be guided heavily by that. However, the issue we listen to is the issue brought across by international community. I'm not surprised everybody is around, because the rate at which the African themselves are taking the mandate to control their own destiny is perpetuating. You can feel it. Those of us who travel Africa-wide, I travel literally, every month I'm in a different country in Africa. I go to Ghana, you see growth you didn't expect to see. You go to Kenya, you see growth you didn't expect to see. The issue is, it is very difficult for Africans for two reasons. The first one, there is heavily multinational which came on board many years ago when majority of our people were not enlightened enough to be able to participate in the economic of then. Meaning, these multinationals still keep on carrying on the ownership of huge resources without understanding that the majority of the youth of the middle level group have to participate in it. Number two, there is a huge barrier to small business trading in Europe. And that is, and the Europeans need to understand that, they need to reciprocate in quality terms. If, for instance, a small company in the middle of, let's say, Cape Town, want to export to the UK or want to export to Germany, it has to meet something called the certification of the European Community Standard. Very expensive process. However, South Africa has its own SABS standard. My question is, if they really want to fair business, why don't they reciprocate, say, if your standard is good enough for your country, should be good enough for our country to empower the other one. And that way we can be able to see fair play.
Gee, so much coming out of that input there, Dr. Karungu, and we'll dissect it, look at some of the factors in a minute. But let me bring in Mr. Mweletsi Mbeki, who is in Beijing. And I just wonder about the view in Beijing. Dr. Karungu is painting a very rosy picture of the growth across the continent. But what do people make of this growth potential in Beijing?
Well, Xolani, I've just had a lunch with officials from Sinosteel, which is one of the Chinese companies which is invested in South Africa, especially in our chrome mining sector, and they have been pointing out to me that they are now having to process they export raw chrome from South Africa and bring it to process it in China because they listed specifically three issues: the cost of electricity in South Africa, the cost of environmental regulations, and the cost of labor in South Africa. So they are saying to me that it's cheaper for them to import raw materials from South Africa, process them here in China. So these are some of the issues that we obviously have to address, because it means instead of jobs being created in South Africa, they are being created outside South Africa.
And that's a very important point. Yeah.
But however, they are still important investors in the mining sector in South Africa, and they are expanding in other countries. They are in Zimbabwe, they are in Gabon, and so on.
And the point being that unless we address issues of labor, environment, electricity, and other infrastructure in South Africa, we'll continue exporting raw materials without beneficiating it, without people benefiting out of those raw materials.
Yes, we really have to. I heard the British minister saying we must not talk about negatives, but if you don't talk about negatives, then you never correct them. The Chinese, this particular company, actually built smelters in South Africa in order to beneficiate chrome, but it finds itself being forced to export chrome unbeneficiated because of all these negatives in our economy. So I think we really have to pay a lot of attention, because a country like China, which has a lot of goodwill towards South Africa and towards other African countries, is now being compelled, because of these negatives, to have to be exporting raw materials all over again.
And the reality is that some of the figures that we heard from Dr. Karunga and some of the figures also bandied about by the World Bank's New Africa Pulse are as a result of the minerals across the continent, are as a result of commodities across the continent. So we need to find ways of enhancing that product.
Yes, you see, a lot of the economic growth in Africa is minerals, especially oil and gas, but it is also services like banking, retail, trade, and so on. What is not really happening in Africa is the growth of manufacturing, and this is the lesson that you have to learn from countries like China. One of the things Sinosteel people mentioned is the cost of the absence of infrastructure in Africa. So that if you open a mine, it's very expensive to open a mine in Africa, because you have to put in place new infrastructure that is not there. At the end of the day, you cannot employ people just by exploiting raw materials. Raw material exploitation is not a major employer of labor, as we have seen in South Africa and in Nigeria and so on.
Dr. Chawla, let me bring you in, because as you would have heard a little bit from the UK's Minister for Africa, The Economist and other experts are telling us that Africa is where India and other countries in Asia were in the early 90s. Now, the question is, how do we replicate the growth that has been seen in Asia since then, and actually even go beyond? How do we make sure that we build on this potential that we have?
The comparison with Asia is quite intriguing, because the Western agenda has always been to try and promote so-called free markets and to weaken the hold of the state and the control of the state on economies, and to make it easier for Western private corporations to come and directly access markets and raw materials in Africa. So it's interesting, because Asia, the trajectory of growth, let's say from the 1970s, Renaissance Capital has this whole report about the fastest billion and how Africa is on the verge of repeating Asia's economic miracle. And McKinsey has also said the same, that these are like the line is on the move, and it's also going to be counted as part of the emerging economy set. But what is important to remember about Asia is that Asia had rather strong states, and many of them adopted protectionist policies. Look at the Asian tigers, the tiger cubs, and so on. And even before that, Japan. You see that the rise of Asia is, informed by rather strong state structures that practiced strategic trade policies, that did what were called industrial policies, that in many ways went against the logic of free trade and globalization, and developed their own, core industries or national champions or core sectors. In the Indian case, for example, it's not so much manufacturing but services, and it's a service-driven growth. In the Chinese case, obviously, it's manufacturing. But in both cases, what is instructive is that these had relatively strong states that regulated their economies and in many ways did not allow foreign multinationals and their patrons in the states backing them to completely dictate terms to them. So Africa, it's also a political issue. I mean, the preceding speakers mentioned infrastructural issues as well as equity issues. At the end of the day, it's about how strong the state structures are, how responsible they are to their own societies, how we can avoid repetition of the whole rentier state phenomenon that has led to the plunder of Africa in the past. Okay. And also, if you look at the agricultural subsidies in Europe, I mean, these have been significant obstacles for Africa's growth. I mean, Walter Rodney wrote about Africa being underdeveloped by Europe through colonialism. But now what you have is, the market access that they're talking about should be in both directions, as one of the preceding speakers said. I mean, if African agricultural exports are, facing these insuperable barriers of cost advantage that European suppliers have,